Okay, hello everybody. We are on to the second part of the video. And what I'm going to do with this one is kind of build on what we did with the first one. So the first video I created was discussing the precursors to the Industrial Revolution, the causes of it, and addressing some of the big questions like why there, why then, and how are things generally changing. What we're doing with this second part is we're going to examine the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, look at the minor revolutions that occur within that first phase, and then how those three subheadings within the first phase of the Industrial Revolution are going to lead to all of these changes that you see in green, blue, purple, black, orange, and red. Okay, so first phase of the Industrial Revolution, there are three different parts. Going through them in the correct chronological order, we begin with an agricultural revolution, move on to a revolution in manufacturing, particularly textiles, and then end with a revolution in transportation. Now, to actually go through that, I want to bring up the mental map that we had done on the board previously. So I want to have this side by side with this. And as we discuss these down here, we're actually filling in this part of the big outline that was on the board yesterday. So agricultural revolution is the first to occur. It's occurring in the 1700s. Remember, new crops coming in from the Columbian Exchange are going to stimulate this, but it's not the new crops in and of themselves. It's in conjunction with the new equipment that's being produced. And keep in mind, new machines are being produced in part because of the scientific revolution. So all of these things are coalescing to create a perfect storm that's going to lead to these major changes that we call the Industrial Revolution. Some of the new equipment that you have to know about, in particular, is going to be the seed drill that mechanizes the planting of seeds. So these things are going to lead to a revolution in agriculture, making agriculture much more efficient, meaning you no longer need so many people working in that field. And remember, in the past, we're talking about like 90% of the population working in agricultural related fields. And now we're simply not going to need that many people anymore because of mechanization. So what is going to happen? The government is going to start to respond by changing the geography of England. And they do that through the Enclosure Acts. But the Enclosure Acts are actually doing two things simultaneously. First, it is changing the geography. The common lands that used to be open to everybody, these are old feudal lands that the serfs could use to farm for the lord, but also could supplement and farm for themselves. These common lands become private and start to be sold off. And many of the capitalists, this newly emerging wealthy group of people, this bourgeoisie, and make a connection here. Where else did we hear the word bourgeoisie? Who are capitalists? Capitalists are the bourgeoisie, who are the merchants, the wealthy urban people that made up the third estate in the French Revolution and were leading the rebellion against the king. So I make that connection. The bourgeoisie, we've seen them before. And when we saw them before, they were the heroes, right? Because they were rising up against the monarchy. But those same wealthy members of the third estate are now going to become the capitalists who are going to turn around and exploit everyone else who was part of the third estate. So they are going to become the exploiters. So this is all changing the geography of things, but at the same time, taxation is changing as well. The Enclosure Acts is kind of trying to get rid of the old feudal system with the common lands and the lord and the nobles and things like that. So the old feudal taxes, which used to be able to be paid in crops, livestock, they're going to be replaced with a demand for cash, with a demand for money. And at this point, there are not many places that you can be employed and you're actually paid with cash. One of the places newly emerging that will do that are factories. So this is kind of pushing people into the factory system. Now, with all this in mind, those small farmers, the previous peasants in the feudal system, who could survive on their own because they had used the common land to supplement the small farm that they had, now they can no longer use the common lands and they're forced to sell. Forced to sell because they can no longer sustain themselves because they simply don't have enough land without the use of the common lands as well. So they have two choices. They either will move to the cities and work in factories, or they will stay in agriculture but now be forced to become a tenant farmer living on somebody else's land. And this is a really bad system, similar to sharecropping in the southern portion of the United States, that it creates a cycle of poverty, a cycle of debt, where the farmer doesn't have enough money to buy necessities, and the capitalist or the owner of the land will offer to give them credit. And just like Britain gets Spain into debt, the landlord or the landowner is going to be getting these tenant farmers deeper and deeper into debt over time. So notice how from the very beginning with the agricultural revolution, it's not just economics that's changing, it's also geography, and it's the social fabric of England. So many things are changing from the very beginning. Okay, moving on. So second bullet point over here is manufacturing revolution. So let's talk about the manufacturing revolution over here. This is the one that we see occurring second. It's shortly after the agricultural revolution and kind of building upon it. Why agricultural revolutions first? Food is your main necessity. What's your probably second main necessity? Clothing. So the next thing that we're going to see happening is that textiles, the textile industry in particular, is going to have a manufacturing revolution. And why that industry? Because it's a necessity. Now, cotton is going to come to replace wool in England simply because it's more comfortable. You can dye it. There are a lot of benefits to cotton. Now, the question is, how does this happen? Because you cannot grow cotton in England. They tried, but it just didn't work. They can grow cotton, however, in places like India. So what Britain needs to do is figure out a way to get India to ship them all of their raw cotton, as opposed to the finished cotton textiles that they had been producing, and let England produce that raw cotton into textiles there in their own country, the mother country, right? And the reason they want to do it there is because they've gotten very efficient at it. They've created new spinning machines, they've created new weaving machines that make this whole process really, really fast. But the problem for making this all work for England is that they can't grow cotton. So they need to rely on somebody else, and they almost have to trick India into doing this. Now, the way they do it, they don't have to touch India at all. They don't have to do anything with India. All they have to do is manipulate their own tariffs on Indian cotton. So what they do simultaneously is they up the tariff on finished Indian cottons coming into England. And then at the same time, they lower the tariff on raw cotton coming into India. And what this is going to stimulate is eventually India. Now, what is it going to do? There is There is now a huge market. Sorry, those are the dogs. Just let them bark. Shh. 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 Okay, sorry guys. There is now a huge market for raw cotton in England. So India is going to take advantage of that, and they're going to start producing predominantly raw cotton, and then they're going to be sending that off to England. So this is how England is able to dominate the cotton trade. Now, with that in mind, within manufacturing, the way the machines are powered is going to be changing. So initially it starts off with water power. You have factories near rivers utilizing water wheels. But once they put two and two together that you can use coal to power machines, then they are going to transition to steam power. Once you do that, you no longer need factories to be near rivers. So factories can be anywhere. And then they're going to start to utilize coal with steam-powered machines. Now, the interesting thing is, how do they discover steam power? Well, as they deforest the country, they have to dig deeper and deeper to get coal for fuel and other things. And as they dig deeper and deeper for coal, the mines are hitting water and starting to fill up with water. So they need to develop a pump that's powerful enough to pump all of that water out. And the way they do it is they're digging coal mines. So they kind of try to use coal to power these machines to pump water out to get more coal. And then somebody has the bright idea that, oh my goodness, we could use this technology not only for water pumps, but for any machine that exists. And now we have this major transition to steam power, which is going to radically change so many different things. And then finally, as these machines are created being powered by coal and steam, not everybody is liking these changes that are occurring. The capitalists are, because it's making things more efficient and therefore they're getting more profit. But the people who had been involved in the putting out system, and remember, the putting out system people are small farmers who farm during the day, and then at night when they go home by candlelight, their family would sit around and do a handcraft, maybe weaving, maybe spinning, something like that. So these people are being displaced because of the Enclosure Acts and being forced to sell their land. If they're no longer small farmers, they also can no longer be small handcraft workers in the evening in the putting out system. So they start to riot. They start to riot against the machines. The machines become the target for their anger. And those riots are, the people involved in those riots are known as the Luddites. And the Luddites are these former putting out system individuals. So now the third bullet point over here, and now we're back to this area over here, is the transportation revolution. Transportation revolution cannot occur until we have steam power. What it's going to do is transform the way we move things via land, but also the way we move things via sea. So it's going to be a combination of using iron and steam power. And the putting process is an interesting thing to consider here, because the production of iron prior to this was happening, but on a smaller scale. Once we combine steam power with the production of iron, we can industrialize the production of iron. So manufacturing revolution, the first thing to happen is textiles, but then iron has a revolution of its own shortly thereafter and becomes industrialized just like the production of textiles does. And the putting process makes that possible. So now you have factories producing iron. Now, once you have factories producing iron, you have a ton of iron, and that's going to be used to get rid of the sailboats, so using wind technology, and create steamships. Steamships that don't have to rely on the wind and can go much, much faster than any sailboat could. And then on land, it's going to replace horses and carts, or pack animals and carts, with railroads. And the comparison there is just, I hope that's not lost on you. You can go so much faster on a train than you could with a horse and cart. So the extreme increase in the speed with which you can move things is unparalleled in all of human history. Even the invention of the airplane, I mean, that's almost along the same lines, but this is probably more dramatic of a difference, the steamships and the railroads. Now, what three things does that increase the movement of? There are three things that are special that we need to consider here. And it goes back to the previous unit we discussed, the mother country colony relationship. There are three big reasons why a mother country needs a colony. First, they need access to the raw materials there. Second, often they're wanting a source of cheap labor. And then third, because they are producing things, they need a market for the finished goods. So think about what this transportation revolution in the 1800s is going to do to the colonial process. Railroads and steamships are going to dramatically increase the speed with which you can move labor, raw materials, and finished products. So what impact might that have on colonization? It's going to ramp it up. It's going to increase it dramatically. So that is phase one of the Industrial Revolution. Now that we've discussed those basic things, let's actually take a look, though, at what changes reverberate out into society and how society is going to deal with this and change itself because of it. Okay, so let's look at labor first and how labor changes. Okay, first we have to consider that people are leaving farming. What's the reason for that? The Enclosure Acts. What's the reaction to that? They have two options now. Those farmers go into either tenant farming or factory wage labor. At the same time that farming is decreasing, the putting out system is disappearing. Why? The cause is the same as up above. The Enclosure Acts, the reaction to this is going to be the Luddites and those anti-machine riots. Next, who is actually laboring or working is changing as well. If you remember, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the family is the economic unit. Everyone within the family is contributing to economics. After industrialization, that's going to change. Who predominantly during this initial phase is contributing to the factories? It's going to be women and it's going to be children. And let me clarify that. It's young unmarried women and children. Now, why is this the case? Simply because capitalists, remember what their goal is: make more money, increase their profits. One way they can do that is pay workers less. Here's the thing with women, unmarried women, young unmarried women and children, they do not demand what we call a family wage. Family wage is needed by adult males because they are supporting an entire family. Young unmarried women, this is simply extra money. Kids, this is simply extra money. So factory owners initially are going to want to hire them simply because they're cheaper. And it goes with the whole goal of capitalism, which is to increase your profits. Okay? So it has to do with that family wage and the fact that they don't need it. Now, who's going to hate this? All of the adult men who are being pushed off of their farms and now have to find work in factories. So a goal is going to be to try to get young unmarried women and then kids out of the factory systems. Because right now, women, young unmarried women and kids are competition. And frankly, they're beating the adult men at getting the jobs simply because they're cheaper. They don't need as much money for their wages. So there are people all along who are pushing for child labor laws because they truly want to get kids out of child labor. But one of the reasons why those laws are actually going to get passed is because adult men need those jobs. And if they can pass child labor laws, they can get kids out of the way. Children are no longer competition, and now they can actually work in those jobs. Now, there is another factor that's going to lead to this switch from using young unmarried women and kids to men. It's a factor with the machines, but we're going to see that in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. So just keep that in mind. Part of it for the child labor laws, part of it is that men have to compete with them and they need to get them out. The other part is going to have to do with something else later. Okay, next, where? Where is labor taking place? Well, we already know that it's transitions from inside the home or near to the home to someplace outside of the home. But that place outside of the home changes over time. So initially, where are factories? They are by rivers. Why? Because they are using water power and water wheels. Later, when they use steam power, which is the why, they can be anywhere. So this is changing over time, and initially by rivers, but later everywhere. Now, labor is also, all of these changes up above, labor is impacting the class structure as well within this society and eventually within most societies. And this is more of a Marxist perspective that we're doing here, or Marxist critique. So according to Marx, if you look at social class diagrams in the past, we have our pyramid, right? Social class diagram. And there are multiple classes. So we have a variety of different types of social classes within any given society. What Marx is going to argue that these labor changes result in, and what capitalism and industrial revolution results in, is that those classes are being distilled down, so that you're going from multiple classes down to essentially two classes of people alive on this planet. You have the capitalists, who are the bourgeoisie. They own the means of production. They own the factories. They own the raw materials. They're the ones who sell the product. And then on the flip side of that, you have the group that is being dominated or being exploited, the workers, otherwise known as the proletariat. And they're the ones who do not own the means of production, do not own the factories. They simply are basically a cog in a machine called the factory, and they go to work. They do their little bit, their little part to contribute to the operation of that machine, the factory, and then they receive a small cash wage in return for that. So Marx is saying that we're seeing something major happening here once we get to industrialization, in that this hugely complex system of class structures in the past is radically changing to distill down to just two: those who have access to things and those who do not. And that kind of has repercussions for today as well. And you might say that Marx was right if you look at the fact that the majority of the world's money, or wealth, we should say, the majority of the world's wealth is concentrated in less than 1% of the population. So you have this class of haves and this class of have-nots. Now, next bit. The other thing that's changing with labor is that it's becoming much more efficient. And there are three things that are contributing to that. One thing that's contributing to that is specialization within that industry. This is the same thing we talked about earlier with Adam Smith. So the fact that within one industry, you have people doing just one part of a bigger job, and they get really good at it, get efficient, and that's going to speed things up and lead to more profit. The other thing, number two here, is that you have interchangeable parts being used. So things have become standardized. And when you make, for example, the top of a desk, you don't have to measure it out each time because now you have a template, you're following it exactly. And for the consumer, if they broke the top of their desk, they could actually go out and just switch it out with another desktop and it would be identical. So interchangeable parts. Once again, if you're standardizing things, you're making things much quicker to produce, therefore more efficient, and therefore getting more profit. And then the final thing is a technology aspect here, and it's the assembly line operating on conveyor belts. The fact that people no longer have to move to the objects that they're making, but rather the objects move in front of them. Once again, speeding up the process, leading to greater efficiency and then greater profit. The final thing we have to talk about here with labor changes is that, and this is also a Marxist critique, is that people are increasingly becoming alienated from their work. Now, what does this mean? In the past, a craftsman owned the workshop, they owned the tools, they would go out and find the resources. And then on top of that, though, they had to be skilled. They had to be a skilled craftsman. And at the end of this, they would produce this beautiful piece that they would then take to market, sell, and reap the benefits from. So in the past, workers were involved in all aspects of the process of production. And there was great pride in actually producing something from the beginning to the end and seeing the benefits from that. Once you get to industrialization and wage labor, you have somebody go to work, they clock in, they make that little bit of that larger thing again and again and again and again and again, repetition after repetition, repetition after repetition. They never really get the feeling of completion at the end of creating something. They aren't the ones who take it to market and sell. They're not reaping the profits from all of their hard labor, except in the form of a small cash wage. So all of that pride and accomplishment and involvement in the process of making something is disappearing once you have industrialization and the factory system and capitalism. At the same time, the factory process with the assembly line, with the specialization that Adam Smith had observed, where you're just doing one part again and again and again, it becomes mindless. It becomes numbing. When people go to work, and this is such a sad thing, but there are so many people in the whole world that when they go to work to get one thing, that paycheck at the end of the week. They're not really going because they like what they're doing. They're not really going because they have any pride in what they're doing. They're going to get that cash wage, that money that's going to enable them to pay their rent and buy things. So the whole, like, imagine what that's doing to people's psyche, right? And just their self-worth. So one of the things that you can consider here with the Industrial Revolution, is it good or is it bad? Well, obviously it's both. There are really good things that are happening, but there are simultaneously really troubling things that are happening as well. So that's labor and labor changes. Okay, next, let's move on to the blue here with the factory system. What are the conditions like in factories? Awful. Two things to keep in mind. They are dirty because they are using coal to power everything. Second, they are dangerous because you actually have little kids falling into the machines and you have no safety precautions as of yet. Okay, changes in location. We already discussed this. They start by rivers and then they move to be anywhere because of the use of steam power and coal. Lowell on the tenement houses. So this initially is going to develop because families don't want to allow their young unmarried women to just move to cities and be on their own. So factory owners start to establish tenements, which are kind of like apartment buildings very near to the factory. And this creates a controlled and safe environment for these young unmarried women to actually be in while they're working in the factories. Lowell is a textile factory owner, and he's going to be creating these tenement houses for these young unmarried women. So just know that connection there. Later, tenements will continue to exist, but more for low-income families who are living and working in those factories. So it transitions from being something to protect those young unmarried women to just being cheap housing for low-paid factory workers who can't afford transportation to actually get to and from work. Next, factory system is going to experience a cycle of innovation. The example that Spodek gives us is weavers and spinners. So that new technology is developed by weavers, new machines that make weaving faster. When that happens, the spinners can't produce enough yarn to actually keep the weavers busy. So the weavers go back to the spinners and start to pressure them to create a better machine for spinning that will allow them to keep up with the speed of weaving. The spinners do that, but they create such a good machine that now spinning is faster than weaving. So the spinners will go to the weavers and pressure them to create a new machine that speeds up the weaving process. And it is simply a back and forth cycle of innovation, so that things over time get better and better and better and faster and faster and faster and faster. And we see that with our technology today as well, that cycle has continued. Finally, factory system, the impact on the environment, it's awful. That's really all you need to know. You know this, the pollution. The pollution is just horrendous. And then romanticism is a reaction to all of these kind of bad changes that we see coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And it's this idea that they want to go back. They want to go back to what? The pristine village life. The clean village before pollution, the village where everybody knew everybody else, and there weren't so many people there packed into small areas. The simple village where people made things by hand and had pride in what they did. So the Romantics want to go back to that. And Romanticism is this movement within art and literature that you really see this pushing back against these radical changes that are happening during industrialization. Okay, next, let's go into the purple. Changes in family occur as well. So look at this. Industrial Revolution is like, you think it might be just economic, but it isn't. Like, it's impacting all of these other things. So the family dynamics change as well. Keep in mind, in the past, work and family went hand in hand. Now what do you see happening? They are physically separated. So that work becomes separate from family. Now think about the repercussions of that. When that happens, that means that you no longer get to see your family as much. And family bonds in the past used to be very, very strong. Those strong bonds are going to start to erode once you have to leave the home for 8, 10, 12, 16 hours a day, and you end up seeing your coworkers, or in your case, your friends and your teachers, more than you see your family. This is going to really put pressure on those bonds of family relationships. And are we better off for it? No, I would argue that we have weaker family units now than we did in the past, because of the changes in economics. The other thing that's changing with families is that Marx, this is a Marxist perspective here, Marx is going to see this thing that he's going to refer to as the double oppression. He's going to say that women, just like men, are being oppressed by capitalists. So women and men who are laborers are being exploited and oppressed by capitalists. But at the same time, women are doubly oppressed because when they leave the factory and go home, they are also then oppressed by the males within their family, whether it be a father or a husband. So that women are in this unique position of facing a double oppression, an oppression in the workplace and oppression at home. And then finally, family changes, birth rates. Birth rates begin to drop during this period because you no longer have so many people involved in agriculture. In the past, having a bunch of kids, if you're a farmer, is a benefit because kids equaled workers. They were your labor. They could help you. And remember, what was the economic unit in the past? It was the family. So big families meant a better economic unit. Once you get to Industrial Revolution, though, and once kids are out of the factories because of child labor laws, what do you do with those kids? Well, now you have to send them to school. They're not producing anything anymore. They're not contributing to the economics of the family anymore. So what do kids in essence become? Kids, frankly, become an economic burden on the family. So that what do you see happening is that people are beginning to limit how many kids they have because they cost a lot of money. Kids are expensive. But that only happened once you hit the Industrial Revolution. Let's move on. Geographically, cities are changing as well. Population is increasing. Why? Because all of these farmers are moving to the city now to find work in factories. Cities, the locations of the big cities are also changing as well. Keep in mind, what do you need for factories? Well, initially you need them to be by rivers, and then later you need them to be close by to coal deposits. So our major cities in the world are close to rivers and coal deposits. Conditions in the cities. We start to see class divisions within cities geographically emerging quite early. There are obviously the rich sections of the cities or the uptown sections, and then there are the slums or the sections of the city for the low class workers. So you see that playing out geographically within cities pretty early on. Population density increases as well, particularly in the slum areas. Why? Because they are building these tenements so that they can pack people in as densely as possible. Because of this and other factors as well, the lack of sanitation, health is really poor in cities, and the death rates are just insane. Mortality rates are crazy high, particularly in cities. Sorry, that's an alarm. Okay, so health is very bad. And then finally, with more and more people and desperate people, people in need of food because they're getting so little wages from factories, you're going to have, with a lot of people, a lot of desperate people, you're going to have a lot of crime. So conditions in cities, they're cramped. There's poor and rich sections. The health and sanitation is awful, and crime is really high. Now, how do we know this? We know this because people went out and researched this, particularly Frederick Engels. Why is he and Marx going to write the Communist Manifesto? Because they're responding to all these bad things that they're seeing as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Why doesn't Smith write about this? Because he didn't live to see most of it. Smith was writing earlier, Marx and Engels are writing later, and they're actually getting to witness these things, these conditions as they occur. So we can't fault Smith for not seeing this. But this is why Marx and Engels are saying what they're saying, as well as other researchers. They're actually seeing it. So people are going out. It's not lost on them. People realize something major, a major change is happening. People get it. And they're out there and they're researching and they're documenting what's happening. So it's an interesting thing. This is kind of, you see the birth of social sciences before this, but this is maybe really the beginnings of the birth of social sciences, the study of humans by other humans. And then on to the orange, we have government reactions. And the government is going to do two things. First, keep in mind who the majority of the government is. Initially, it's going to be the landed gentry, those large land owning nobles, the feudal lords from the past. And one of the things they don't like is this change that's occurring, because with industrialization, land no longer equals power. What equals power? Having wealth and owning factories. And you don't need a lot of land in order to do that. So one of the government reactions early on is going to be to pass laws to protect this whole idea of land equals power, to protect the power of the nobles, of the landed feudal lords. One way they're going to do that is to pass these corn laws. Now, what are these corn laws? The corn laws were actually high tariffs on corn coming from outside of England that forces everybody in England to now just purchase corn from those old feudal lords, keeping that important, so now corn and agriculture continues to be important because the growers in England have to supply for everyone in England. They can no longer outsource and get it from other countries. And this was a great thing for them because it kept them relevant. It kept them important. Here's the thing. People don't like it because they raise the prices on corn, and corn is almost a necessity. You need it for all these things. So people revolt and the law is overturned. But this is an initial government reaction that they're going to try to pass laws to kind of stop this from happening. And governments, particularly when the people in power are the people who used to have traditionally power in that country, the government is always going to respond in this kind of conservative way, try to keep the past because they're afraid of the changes of the future. Here's the thing, you can't stop those changes from happening. Successful countries are going to see the way the wind is blowing and change to and adapt to kind of go in and dominate that new system. The worst thing you can do, and this is a really good example of it, the worst thing you can do is try to go back to the way things were. It never works. And government responses to industrialization is a good example of that. And a lot of lessons can be learned from this, even today in how we run things. So that's the Corn Laws. Peterloo is another example of how the government reacts. And what Peterloo showed is that the government is going to react when people rise up and rebel, even peaceful protests. The government is going to react by attacking them and killing them. So the government reacts by using violence. And that's what Peterloo shows us. Now, there are a whole bunch of other things, though, that governments are doing. So competition is going to increase in Europe. And as that happens, here we go. And as competition increases in Europe, now you're starting to see some other countries become industrialized as well. And the only thing I want you to know for this is that there are 3 phases to the countries that become industrialized. During the first phase, Britain is the one who industrializes. We know that. We know Britain is first. But after that, then we have a phase where America and Germany become industrialized and really become industrial powerhouses. And during the final phase, you have 2 other groups, which we will talk about later, entering into industrialization as well. And those 2 countries are going to be Russia and Japan. So once again, the increasing competition, not only in Europe, but just in general in regards to industrialization, is that you have Britain doing it first. Then, shortly thereafter, you have America and Germany starting to really industrialize. And then finally, you have countries like Russia and Japan. So there are almost 3 phases to the way industrialization is going to spread throughout the world. And what is stimulating that spread? Competition. Okay, next, neocolonialism. Just keep in mind that the whole time that these economic and social things are changing, that's going to be changing the way colonialism works as well. Britain's going to realize that you don't need to go in and invade countries in order to kind of manipulate their economies to your advantage. So we're going to see new ways of colonizing, and that's coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And then finally, and we know all of that information with India. India is our perfect example there with cotton. And then finally, we have this huge connection between the Industrial Revolution and war, which will come back and impact us when we see and study the First World War and the Second World War, and even the Crimean War directly before that. So what we have happening is if we have industrial factories, factories where manufacturing is just so efficient, what can you begin to produce very quickly? What can you begin to produce very, very quickly? Weapons. And once weapons are weapons are industrialized and you can produce them very, very efficiently, of course, you can produce more of them. This is going to have a huge impact on the way wars are fought. With more weapons, we're going to see for the first time huge, huge, huge death tolls. People are not ready for this. And there are going to be dramatic reactions against that. So you just need to realize that not only is production of everyday necessities going to be industrialized, but unfortunately, so are the weapons of war. And this is going to have major repercussions later. Okay, finally, after all of these changes occur, now we see new theorists coming out and discussing this thing called capitalism and discussing this thing called the Industrial Revolution and offering critiques of it. So we're at Karl Marx, and let's talk through Marx. First, before we get to the sheet, and I'll pull his sheet up here, Before we get to this side, I want to consider the historical context of Karl Marx. Why is he observing and writing what he is? Because he's living and writing and observing after Adam Smith. So he gets to see all of the changes that are taking place once capitalism and industrialization is really embraced. And his writings are a response to that, just like Smith's writings are a response to the really innovative things that Britain was doing. And noticing brilliantly how the world was changing and becoming more specialized in so many different ways. So Marx, just like Smith, is responding to what he is seeing, and in a way limited by that. So let's go over here. According to Karl Marx, what is the real source of wealth and power? Adam Smith would say it's the product, the thing that's made, and therefore the profit you can get from the sale of that thing. Marx has this entirely different idea that really the source of wealth, the source of real power, is not the thing, but the ability to make that thing. It's the creative act, the ability to create that is in every single human being. So whereas Adam Smith puts the emphasis on this object and profit, Karl Marx puts the emphasis solidly on people. And this is going to shift his entire perspective. And he's going to be much more concerned with people. Number two, what is the real goal of every individual, according to Karl Marx? Well, Adam Smith sees societies that are so much focused more on individuals, right? And we see that in England going back even to not Hobbes, but Locke. Remember what Locke said the purpose of government was: to protect people's stuff. People's stuff. I'm going to agree to this government thing because I, the individual, want you, the government, to protect my stuff. I do it for a greedy purpose, right? I want protection for my things. And so that's coming out of this society, right? That focuses on the good of the individual as opposed to the overall good necessarily of the community. Well, Marx realizes that not all societies in the world value individual rights over the good of the community. In fact, there are many societies that value the good of the community over what an individual desires in and of themselves, and have embedded in their cultures this idea that, well, maybe you'll give up some of the things that you want because it's better for the society as a whole. China has that ideology going back to the very beginning. They value the community, the good of the community, much more than the rights of an individual. Same thing with Islam in the Middle East. Now, the connection I hope you're making here is that not necessarily with Islam in the Middle East, but the extreme reactions against capitalism and the West that we see in the world today, a lot of it emanates from this fact that those are communities that don't put as much value on individual rights. They value the good of the community so much more than what one individual might want. And capitalism, it just simply doesn't fit with that. They think it's a corrupt thing. They think it's a greedy thing. And so they rebel against that. And often when Western countries are going in trying to help these other countries, they don't realize this huge disconnect in this idea of what do you value more, individual rights, or do you subsume individual rights under this larger goal of the welfare of the community at large? So this is a really fundamental thing that Marx is picking up on here. And Marx would say that the real goal of every individual in many societies is to create a strong, healthy community. It's not so much about the individual, but it's about a strong, healthy society, a strong, healthy community. Now, this also does make sense, though, why some countries are going to embrace communism later on, because they do believe in the good of the community as opposed to individual wealth. Number three, history is defined by what kind of struggle, and the current manifestation of that struggle is who versus who. So Marx, of course, we discussed this, is going to say that history is defined by a class struggle. And increasingly, this is becoming a class struggle between bourgeoisie, who are your capitalists. Once again, remember, this is the bourgeoisie coming from the French Revolution. And then versus the proletariat, who are your workers, right? The haves versus the have-nots, the 1% versus the 99%. Down here, why will capitalists always exploit workers? Why is exploitation inherent in capitalism, according to Karl Marx? Well, Adam Smith would say that individual greed is a good thing because it's going to lead people to want to get more profits from what they're producing. And the way to get more profits from what you're producing is to make a better product or make things more efficient, right? So Adam Smith is going to say that what capitalists do with their profits is reinvest in their company to make things better so that they can make more money, right? Karl Marx is going to say that in theory that makes a lot of sense, and sometimes that actually does happen, and often that actually happens. But more often than not, the way people are going to increase their profit is to exploit their workers. So if they are a little bit low or profits are decreasing, what is a capitalist going to do? Well, today in a modern society, right, they might turn off the air conditioning because air conditioning costs a lot of money. Doesn't really change the product, but is it hurting your workers? Absolutely. But is it going to save you a buck and increase your profits? Absolutely. So Marx is going to say that a capitalist is going to be doing things like that well before they ever reinvest in the company in order to increase profits. In essence, he's going to say there are easier ways to increase one's profit than by reinvesting. The easiest way to do that is to exploit your workers. So decrease the working conditions, take away some of the things that they have, making their conditions a little bit worse, but allowing you to make more money. Number 2, you can lower their wages. Number 3, you can get rid of workers. You can lay off workers. Number 4, this happens all the time, you can go out and find a cheaper raw material that isn't as high quality and use that to make your product, but none of your consumers are any wiser because they don't know that you've just gotten that cheaper raw material. So, a lot of things that you can do in order to increase your profits, and Karl Marx is going to say that capitalists will do those easier things before doing what Adam Smith observed. Now, keep in mind, who's right? They are both right. You see people doing both things and doing both things simultaneously. So do we have innovation and reinvesting in capitalism? Absolutely. Do we have exploitation in capitalism? Absolutely. Are they happening at the same time all the time? Absolutely. Finally, down here, what does Karl Marx say is eventually going to happen? Eventually, he's going to say that the workers are going to realize that they have the real power. Why? The logic here is identical to the political revolutions. Keep in mind, Marx is living after the political revolutions that we study. How did people wake up? Remember the movie Bug's Life. They realize that they have power because there are more of them. And what they're going to do is unite, work together to overthrow their oppressor. In the past unit, people were working together to overthrow the monarchs. What is Marx going to say eventually is going to happen? All of these workers, the proletariat, are going to realize, just like those ants, that they have the power. They are going to unite, and they are going to overthrow the capitalists. So workers unite. That's where that phrase actually comes from. Finally, down here, we've already answered this. According to Marx, what do capitalists actually do with their profits? Well, this is slightly different. I'm sorry. What do capitalists do with their profits? According to Marx, capitalists hoard a lot of that money. All you have to do as evidence of that is look where the owners of businesses live compared to the workers. Look at the cars that owners of businesses drive, and compare that to the vehicles that workers have, if they can afford them, right? So just look at the disparity in income between those two, and you can see that, frankly, where's a good portion of the profit going if you're a capitalist? It's going to you and your family. And is that wrong? Not necessarily, right? There might not be anything wrong with that. That's an individual decision for you to make, right? Okay, so, and then finally, according to Karl Marx, what is the impact of capitalism on society? Well, he's going to say it's bad. It's bad for all of these different reasons, right? Now, unlike other people, though, He's not going to say we should go back to what we had previously. He's saying that we need capitalism. We need capitalism and this awful thing to happen to wake people up so that the proletariat rebels against the bourgeoisie, rebels against the capitalists. We need capitalism to happen to force people to wake up and rebel to create this brand new system. And what is this brand new system going to be? Communism, of course. And in a later unit, we're going to talk about how communism just is a flawed system. But keep in mind, this is what it's leading to. Marx does not want to go back to the past. He's not like the Romantics. He's seeing something else coming out of all of this. And that capitalism eventually, he says, is going to turn into something else. He proposes that it's going to turn into communism. I think it's hard to argue against the fact that eventually capitalism will change into something else. It will happen. Capitalism will disappear. Something else will take its place. The question is it going to be a communist system? And I think there's a lot of arguments against that actually being the case. But just like Smith is really brilliant with seeing things, so is Marx. He's really brilliant at pulling out some of the things that are happening once industrialization is actually taking place. He's also really brilliant in looking at the practical things, like there's theory, but then there's actually what's happening on the ground, and Marx can observe that. And then I think he's also really brilliant in showing how eventually, just like political revolutions, we may have a revolution occurring within economics as well. So some interesting things coming from both Adam Smith and Karl Marx, two different perspectives, and I would say, equally good and bad in their theories. Both have flaws, both have really brilliant things that they've observed. Okay, that's it for this first phase. Come back for the second phase of the Industrial Revolution and the final third video.